An essential ingredient was that the political officers also have huge street cred with the soldiers. They couldn't just be Pharisaic sky pilots or candy ass weenuses. Hello, friends. Welcome to Type 56, the story of China's army. I'm Jason Clower. It's a story as old as the PLA. On a battlefield somewhere, a Chinese unit is getting its teeth knocked out, and the leadership cadre is dead, and all the squaddies are preparing to depart this world and go to the non existent communist afterlife to meet Marx. Out of nowhere, a political officer pops up and yells, "Follow me!" And almost invariably, he gets shot in the head, but the unit survives thanks largely to that political officer showing up in the worst place at the worst time. Who were these political officers? Why did they exist? And what did they do when they weren't getting shot in the head? Let's talk about that today. Here's the very standard, potted English language explanation of political officers, which is true, but in my opinion, not very informative. It goes like this. The PLA practices a dual command system. PLA units have both a military commander and a political officer. I'm going to call them today the CO and the political officer. They share command, they're peers, they're equal in rank and authority, and they have a division of labor. The CO heads up what's called the military work, the 军事工作, and the operational side. And the political officer takes on the bulk of what the PLA calls the political work, 政治工作. Okay, all of that is true, if not super illuminating. Let's see if we can do better today. As a first pass, let's start with the company, since the company is the basic building block of PLA life. It's the soldier's home, hearth, and family. His whole life as a soldier, his whole existence, are contained in that company. It's his family. The other soldiers are his brothers. His squad leader and his platoon leader, they are his big brothers. And the company CO is the family's father. The political officer is kind of like the family's mother, an efficient, capable housekeeper, sometimes a tiger mom. The political officer is the company's nurturing and protective den mother. Okay, now, from the company, zoom up with me for a moment to 50,000 feet to the general staff level, or what the PLA calls the general departments, 总部. Now, let's remember for a moment the PLA's traditional, really handy and pragmatic three-way division of labor. For the moment, I'm going to call those three functions operations, people, and stuff. Obviously, in a military unit, somebody has to run the military operations. The PLA uses a few words for that role, but for today in English, I'm simply going to call that person the commanding officer, the CO. He's the one who runs military operations. There definitely has to be an ops chief. And for a subunit as small as a three-man fire team or a squad or a platoon, that's all you need. One leader can handle all the functions, and he is the team leader, squad leader, or platoon leader. At the level of a company, you need a little more division of labor. The CO still runs the military operations, but now there are also 100 plus bodies and mines to take care of, and also a mess squad to oversee, and just generally a lot of company housekeeping. So the PLA adds somebody else to the command staff to take on some of those extra functions. Obviously, military operations will stay with the military commander. That's his whole reason for existing. And that leaves the people function or the stuff function. Well, class, in official Maoist doctrine, what's more significant and powerful? People or mere stuff? People. So at the company level, when we can add one more person to the command staff, that person will be a people specialist who handles people work, or what the weird CCP lexicon calls political work. 政治工作. As we're going to see, calling it political work is really a misnomer. Even in Chinese, it's very, very dated sounding. It sounds like it comes out of the Yan'an caves of the 1930s. Because even though the political officer does give the troops their weekly political indoctrination lesson, that's just one measly afternoon a week. But that is practically the least of the political officer's duties. The rest of his week, he tends to his flock in a dozen other ways that may at first blush look disconnected or scattershot to us in the West. I'm going to tell you about all of those in just a minute. But in Maoist terms, all of his disparate looking functions are perfectly coherent if you understand the inner logic, which we're going to do today. Let's get back to those functions now. As the unit's people specialist, the political officer handles first personnel functions, inducting new soldiers into the service, assigning them to units, deciding who's good enough to be promoted, handling discharges and resettlement. Sometimes that even gets the political officer into weird territory. Like in the old days of China's one child policy, when the company would get a new deputy political officer, like as not, he would be astonished to learn that he was now in charge of supervising all the married officers' mandatory birth control. And he would probably be an unmarried guy in his early 20s, maybe a first lieutenant, and he'd probably made a very brave and capable platoon leader. But now he had to be thinking, are you kidding? I've never even seen a naked female. And now I'm supposed to go ask the CO uncomfortable questions about what he and his wife are using. I mean, I serve the people, but boundaries. But even that is not the real job. Where the political officers truly earn their keep is in anything that could be described, however remotely, as winning hearts and minds. From the birth of the PLA, political officers were in charge of boosting the two assets that the classic PLA needed in huge abundance, namely morale in their troops and goodwill from the peasants and the populace. Back in the days of the Civil War, when the PLA was just a huge guerrilla force, they compensated for their abominable armament with their crusading, quasi religious zeal and motivation. That, together with a lot of low level initiative, that surging revolutionary morale gave the PLA its outsized mobility and aggressiveness and risk tolerance and persistence that made them punch far above their weight. If you and your buddies are motivated so abundantly that nothing can make you quit, eventually you must prevail because you'll be willing to wait for years prowling around in the mountains, just watching and waiting and striking when you can. If nobody can outweight you, nobody can outfight you in the end. Of course, while the communist guerrillas were out there in the mountains being aggressive and unsupervised, and living off the land, they needed to win the goodwill of the local peasants and keep that goodwill. Because that way, the peasants would provide the communists with supplies and intel and recruits. So the prime directive was don't piss off the peasants, win their hearts and minds. Just like troop morale, that early PLA needed enough popular will to fill a fleet of tanker trucks. Therefore, to manage the Communist Army's alliances with the many, many peasant villages, the PLA political officer was a full-time military diplomat. After all, if you're an armed insurgency and you really value the peasants as your principal ally and resource and force multiplier, just like all your slogans say you do, then by golly, you should have a full-time staff officer nurturing that relationship. Otherwise, all your talk about the army and the peasants being as intimate as a fish and water are just empty slogans. Therefore, your unit needed a military diplomat who would serve as your ambassador to the peasantry. That was the political officer. And he had to have equal authority with the unit's military commander to give real world teeth to this philosophy of aligning the PLA always and everywhere with the peasants and their interests. If the political officer didn't have parity with the commanding officer, then that ideal of the inseparable oneness of the communist army and the peasantry would just devolve into an empty platitude, and the CO could just dismiss the political officer if he wanted to as a civil affairs weenie who thinks that he's going to win the war by PowerPoint. Okay, so the unit has now decided it's going to make a stand for some reason. And now suppose that the military commander decides, okay, in order to have a clear field of fire to our east, I need to go demolish that cluster of peasant houses over there. That would be very ticklish. The political officer would definitely need to be in the loop on that. I'm not saying that it couldn't be done. Maybe in the end, the peasant houses were going to have to be cleared away with compensation and all kinds of stuff. But that would be a major, major military political calculus behind that decision. It wouldn't just be like an officer casually yelling, Sergeant, go torch those hooches. So that's why the political officer wasn't just the personnel administrator. As the people manager, he had to handle hearts and minds, and that meant public relations and civil affairs too. Now, let's zoom from that function, winning hearts and minds outside the army with the peasantry, back over to the political officer's function as what we would call the morale officer. Why does that also have to be a function of the political officer, according to Maoist logic? I mean, from our perspective, it might look like an arbitrary connection, but from a Maoist perspective, they are obviously inseparable, as my thumb and my index finger are. Why? Well, one reason is really simple. If the political officer is the guy who wins hearts and minds outside the army with the peasantry and the populace, then of course it's just natural that he would be the right person with the right tools to win hearts and minds inside the army with the soldiers themselves. He's got the skill set. He has the sort of soft touch with people. And also he's got the tools. Since he's already handling the unit's housekeeping, the political officer would be perfectly positioned to just make the soldiers' lives better and easier in all the hundred little ways that make a company a happy family. The company mess is very important to this. Chinese people are ingenious cooks. Personally, I think that they are the best in the world, and they really love to eat. And so the PLA has a saying, if a company is blessed with a good mess squad, their political officer's job is already half done. Meaning, good food goes a long way toward making good morale. Also, if Private Zhang San's dad has gotten like run over by a tractor back in the village, then the political officer is going to find Private Zhang San and send him home on family medical leave. If Private Li Si is thinking he wants to stay in the army and make a career of it, great. The political officer will go sit him down over a cup of tea and they'll talk and see if this kid is really lifer material. And if there's a private who needs a medical discharge, you might think that that would be simple, but sometimes it gets complicated in a way that takes exactly somebody as deft as the political officer to untangle it. I read one account from an artillery regiment in the 70s where the command staff won special praise from their chain of command for handling this delicate situation. You will not believe what this was. There was a private in their regiment who got hepatitis, and he had to be discharged and sent back to his village on a medical. Well, the private refused to go. He said, look, if I go back to my village before my term of service is up, everyone back home will say that it's because I washed out of the army and I couldn't hack it. So his political officer assured him, don't worry, your files and your discharge papers will clearly show that it was a medical discharge. Nothing related to your aptitude, nothing related to your conduct, no black mark at all. But still, the private dug in his heels and said, no, even if the paperwork says medical discharge, people in the village are still going to spread rumors that it was actually because I was a fuck up or a disciplinary case. And I'm going to live in that village for the rest of my life, which means that rumor will follow me forever. So he said, I refuse to go home. Honestly, friends, I don't know how a Chinese private with hepatitis refuses to leave the army, but this is the thing about Chinese culture. Sometimes it can surprise you by being unexpectedly tender and humane, usually in a way involving what Chinese people call 人情味儿, a sort of like warmth in interpersonal relations. So in this case, I guess the company really was such a family that even if one of the brothers was oozing noxious viruses, they weren't going to throw him out of the sidewalk and say, here's some civvies and a bus ticket. Now sod off. You're dead to us. So eventually, the command staff struck a deal with the diseased and frightened private. And this deal had to be the handiwork of that political officer. The deal was that the lad would be escorted home personally by his company CO. Not his squad leader, not his platoon leader, not even the company XO. No, the CO himself would take the boy home and personally tell his parents and neighbors what a good soldier he'd been, that the army was stricken to lose such a promising young man to this terrible disease. That was the only way that the boy could feel sure that he wouldn't become a pariah back home and be chased forever by invidious rumor. Friends, let me say it again. That deal absolutely had the fingerprints of the boy's political officer all over it. How do I know? Well, for one thing, it took weeks to talk him around to this. That's right, weeks after the infectious invalid was diagnosed, he still wouldn't accept a discharge. And they weren't going to force him to take it. So that whole time, the political officer was negotiating patiently with this frightened and stubborn teenager. The company CEO was definitely not going to be the one like holding space for all this drama of passing the Kleenex to private viral load. That had to be the political officer doing that because don't no CO have time for that crap. And I don't think anybody but the political officer could prevail on even the most fatherly company commander to make him spend a full day in a Jeep, like juddering along unpaved roads in the countryside through mountains where even goats would fear to tread, and then deliver this infected boy to his parents. And then, too, remember, the company commander was going to have to stay overnight in this remote village and be feted as a visiting dignitary by the kindly folk of Hepatitis Village. And probably under the table, he'd be like furtively cleaning his chopsticks with rubbing alcohol so he wouldn't catch a bug. And then, as the guest of honor at this banquet, he would have to get drunk with them and sing revolutionary songs and tell war stories and spend the night under their roof. I mean, all very, very, very kind and typically Chinese hospitality, but maybe not the top of the CEO's priority list. And then, after after being drunk and spending the night in this uncomfortable peasant hut, the CEO would finally have to endure the awful ride the next morning in the bumping, lurching Jeep with a sawtoothed hangover. All of that for one kid? Definitely. That was the political officer's machination. So by now, I think we've established that being a political officer, it doesn't just involve looking after the men's food so that morale doesn't suffer, but it also entails an appalling amount of emotional labor. Okay, got it. And obviously, personnel work is important, and morale building and soldier welfare are important, and so is public relations and civic affairs. Agreed. And yes, it does seem efficient to maybe house those functions with one person who's probably highly extroverted by nature. So, yes to all of that. But why do all of these functions count as political work? It's because, from a Maoist mindset, there really is scarcely any distinction between personnel administration and soldier welfare and civil affairs and political and moral, dare I say, spiritual education. So, as an example, let's take the PLA term mobilization. 动员 sounds like it means like sending out draft notices and activating reservists, right? Yeah, it includes that. And in the main, that Chinese word equals mobilization in English. So, like, for example, when China prepared to invade Vietnam in late 1978, as they were spooling up the war machine, the political officers were in charge of mobilizing manpower. And as we saw in an earlier episode, the political officers poured new soldiers into the divisions to bring them up to their full authorized strength, and they needed to create enough leadership cadre. So they promoted privates and junior NCOs to higher positions, and then they transferred people around. We've seen all that in this other episode. With all of that moving personnel, lots of soldiers and officers got very, very upset. And that hurt morale for a lot of the individuals and companies. These guys wanted to stay with the families that they knew, the companies that they had come up in. So, since we're political officers, job number one is to maintain morale, They had to do a lot of this emotional labor, like encouraging the guys who are being promoted to responsibilities that they didn't feel ready for and assure them that they had what it took. They had to console the men who were being pushed out of their warm and comfortable company nest into some other outfit. Like I read one account from a unit where this one guy was offered a promotion that he was really excited about, but it did entail a transfer to another unit. Okay, he decided to take that. However, right after he accepted it and packed his bags, his old company was mobilized for war in Vietnam. Now that they were going to war without him, suddenly he wanted to change his mind, cancel his promotion and transfer, and ship out with his buddies. He was frantic to stay with his friends. Well, that was not going to happen. The orders had been cut, and the big green machine of the PLA was grinding its way forward now. However, the way that they handled this guy's case was classic PLA, and I think really sweet and typical of the nicest things about the Chinese way of doing things. They did not tell this guy, too bad, soldier, your ass belongs to the army. Report to your unit in 48 hours, or you will be listed as AWOL. No, in the PLA terms, this was a morale matter. This was a hearts and minds matter. They don't just want the soldiers to obey, they want the soldiers to obey for the right reasons. It's very, very important to the PLA. Enter the battalion political officer, the 教导员. He had to do a lot of what they call thought work with him, 思想工作. Friends, this is a lieutenant colonel equivalent who is busy, like, planning a war. But nevertheless, he makes time to sit down with this young guy and say, in effect, I know how sad this makes you, but we're soldiers, we're here to serve the people. And in your new unit, you'll make good friends. And one day you'll look back on this, assuming you're not cut in half by shell fire, and you'll think, I'm so glad I said yes to that challenge. I think that's really sweet. So when the PLA says mobilization, 动员, it includes all of that, not just moving men around on a spreadsheet, but also the spiritual mobilization, the psychological mobilization, meaning the political officers got the men's buy-in and enthusiasm for their mission. Before the Vietnam invasion, they were also screening a lot of patriotic war films for the men that were heavy on ideology, including actually a lot of Soviet propaganda films about the Great Patriotic War. Little ironic considering that they were going to Vietnam to fight a Soviet client precisely because they were too Soviet influenced. Also, as part of thought mobilization or psychological mobilization, the political officers looked after soldiers who were buckling psychologically. I read one very, very typical account of a soldier in an artillery regiment who was so frightened before deployment that he was getting self-deletional. So they set up this relay of officers from his company and from battalion and regimental HQ to come talk sense to him, kind of round the clock. Now, to be clear, this was not Oprah's Super Soul Sunday. Don't picture teddy bears and aromatherapy sessions. Chinese culture's idea of sympathy and counseling involves a lot of tough love. When I was young, where I worked, the party officials would sometimes counsel married couples in the work unit who were having relationship trouble in a way that definitely would not fly here in California. So the cadre might go into their home and sit them down and then first say to the wife, look, comrade, your husband's right. You do talk a lot. And let's be honest, you're about a six. You're lucky that you married a guy who finished high school and doesn't come home drunk. But then in the very next breath, he or she, the cadre, might round on the husband and say, and you, considering how short and fat you are, you won the lottery with this girl. We all thought she was out of your league. So the two of you just cool it, appreciate each other more, and stop complaining about how you both deserve better. Tough love, friends. Be that as it may have noticed the political officer performed many of the functions served in, say, the US military by the chaplain. That's not just a curious coincidence. The company was not just the soldier's family, it was also his church. And the political officer was its spiritual shepherd, explicitly its spiritual shepherd. Chinese communism talks about spirituality and the spirit all the time, much more than the US Army. Recently, as it happened, the US Army did release what it calls a spiritual fitness guide. I'll link to it in this description. First, you must finish the video. As far as I can tell, the US Army started talking about spiritual fitness in 2009, and good for them. And the Army got crap for that. Meanwhile, over in the PLA, they have been talking about and training spiritual mobilization and spiritual education and spiritual support for almost 100 years. Granted, the Chinese word for spiritual, 精神, carries some different overtones than English and it has a broader meaning, but that is the word. And the political officer was indeed the company's spiritual director, exactly like good old Father Ian is the spiritual director up the street at St. Cyril. And just like a priest, the political officer always had a boatload of pastoral work because he had 100+ souls to care for and train and form and strengthen. And also, for the political officer, among those people, there would be some very hard cases. People who had seen some shit, some square pegs, by which I don't mean screw ups, but people who came from what today we would call disadvantaged backgrounds or generational trauma, and whose psychological and social software worked differently from the way that the Maoist army wanted it to. To make this concrete, let's consider a hypothetical 1950s PLA Air Force unit up in the northeast of China. Who and what did that political officer have to deal with there? Well, first, the unit would probably be recruiting largely from an area in the northeast where there weren't just a lot of Han people, but also ethnic Manchus, Mongolians, and Koreans. By Chinese standards, all those northeasterners were very independent people. Also, they had been through hell for decades. The whole region used to live under a Japanese puppet state called Manzhouguo, whose puppet monarch was the deposed last emperor of the Qing dynasty, the Emperor Puyi, with a Japanese supported army at his back to keep him in power. So those poor folks were getting exploited by and maybe drafted by a Japanese sock puppet to fight against the nationalists and the communists. Then the Northeast got liberated by the Soviets, liberated. And since they were technically an enemy state and Japanese ally, the Russians gave them the full Soviet liberation bonus package that included a lot of looting and robbing and the other thing. Then the Northeast cities got reoccupied by the nationalists and their countryside got taken over by the communists. And so now their home was host to more civil war. And in the Northeast, that actually became a large scale conventional war, meaning big formations of heavy artillery in a World War II European theater sized clash of arms. During the Battle of Changchun, for example, about as many people died as in the Battle of the Bulge and the invasion of Okinawa put together. My point in all this is that in our hypothetical PLA Air Force unit in the 50s, they were living in and recruiting from Traumaville. The political officers up there had their work cut out for them. Because after all those decades of horrors, on one hand, some recruits would be hungry for something to believe in, something like communism. But others would have been spiritually cauterized. They would be nihilists and cynics who weren't easily going to buy into like rah rah, hooray for socialism, moto bullshit. The political officers were going to have to work hard with them to make them into true believers. But there was an even bigger problem. From a Marxist Leninist Maoist point of view, all of that mass trauma was much less important than the fact of class differences. Remember, these people, these Maoists, were true believing, religiously fervent communists which meant they looked at everything through the lens of class analysis. That is just the basic theology of communist doctrine. For their purposes, in a perfect world, the PLA maybe could have recruited from nothing but landless peasant families. They were Maoism's favorite, most victimized, most revolutionary class, supposedly. But in the real world, the PLA just needed a lot of other people. They needed some city kids too, because they tended to have better schooling and just better nutrition, better bone length. Of those city kids, maybe only a few would be stinking intellectuals like me. And hopefully, most of them would come from families of factory workers, proletarians. But either way, those city kids would still be accustomed to more comfort than the peasant recruits. They would expect more from life. They would probably approach the military more as a career opportunity than a religious crusade. So even they wouldn't be ideal human material for the PLA. As a friend of mine used to say, some soldiers need the army. For other soldiers, the army needs them. And for some of these city kids, the PLA needed them, needed their educations, needed their skills. And so the political officers were then just going to have to sharpen their morale, increase their class consciousness, nudge their character beyond just soft-handed bourgeois individualism toward a selfless commitment to socialism. Because the PLA was willing to take recruits who might not have enlisted for the right reasons, but they just didn't want the recruits to stay that way. They wanted to enculturate them and give them what they unabashedly called correct thinking. The PLA was very much a missionary organization that believed passionately that they could and should reform fallen people and guide them to the straight and narrow. And also, speaking of the PLA needing some people with unsavory backgrounds, you might remember that for a long time, the PLA Navy and Air Force relied heavily on technicians and trainers who had once fought for the nationalists and even, may Chairman Mao forgive me for saying this vile name, even the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service. Those people's class consciousness needed some very serious overhauling. But somewhere was a political officer who was ready to take on that job. Okay, friends, now that I've made you eat your boring spiritual vegetables, now we can talk about battles and explosions and stuff. The PLA didn't invent political officers just out of some high-minded concern for the human spirit and to pep up morale as a good in itself. No, the PLA was an army first, with a crappy budget. And they wouldn't feed and maintain all these extra officers unless they could tangibly boost military readiness and lethality. I mean, remember, the PLA was barely willing to spend money to buy the troops enough SKSs and practice ammo. And even at a time when the PLA cheaped out on giving units radios and they told them make do with bugles and runners instead, they still spent the money to place political officers in every blessed company under heaven. Answer? Yeah, you bet they did. Because a good political officer who's like a fisher of men for communism could be an incredible force multiplier. In Maoist military theory, where the fighting spirit of the men and the country is paramount, the political officer could be the most militarily valuable soldier in his unit. After all, in a Western army, what if the Department of Defense had a device that it could issue to units to make their soldiers better fighters and make them embrace the suck twice as hard as before? What if the device could increase unit cohesion twice as much? And units that had this device were more aggressive and less risk averse, and their wounded men would even refuse evacuation so they could keep fighting. What if you could also give this device to a battalion and it would make the men train twice as hard? And if a brigade headquarters had this device, in their area of operations, the indigenous population would like their forces better, and the village elders wouldn't mess with them and would actually help them. And maybe they would even give them things. Would the DoD be interested in that device? Yes. Well, the PLA always believed They had that device in the political officer. To make this device work, though, an essential ingredient was that the political officers also have huge street cred with the soldiers as respected, combat capable leaders. They couldn't just be Pharisaic sky pilots or candy ass weenuses. Quite the opposite. For a long time in the PLA, most officers were switch hitters. They would serve as commanders for a couple years, then maybe as political officers, then maybe they would go back again. Whatever role the army needed from them, that's what they would do. Even later, as PLA officers started to specialize a little more, they still all came from the same background. Roughly speaking, everyone in the PLA started as a squaddie. Then maybe he rose to be a squad leader, and you cannot fake being a good squad leader. If he was good, then maybe they would make him a platoon leader. And there too, if he stood out from the other platoon leaders, then they would move him to a company position. And at that point, maybe he would start to gravitate toward command roles or political work. But maybe not even then. You might remember Tang Lijong, the satchel charge hero of Hill 815. If you haven't heard that story, I can't do justice to it here. I'll just link in the description. But suffice it to say, Tang Lijong single-handedly attacked one and the same pillbox 5 times using defective munitions before he finally blew that thing into orbit. Anyway, what do you think happened to him after the war? He was one of the lucky heroes of the Sino-Vietnamese War who survived to receive his medal. Well, afterward, they sent Tang to officer candidate school, and then he commanded a platoon and later a company. And after that, he became a battalion XO. And then after that, he became a battalion political officer, 教导员. Only then did he start specializing in commissar billets at higher and higher levels. Tang retired only about 10 years ago as a senior colonel, which is like a British brigadier. It's a counterpart to a US one-star general, except they don't get the title of general. Anyway, that brings us to the political officer's last 2 superpowers, which have to do with what he can do for the military commander, the CO. Superpower number 1, the political officer gives the CO a deeper leadership bench. The CO cannot be in 2 places at one time, but he can be in one place and then send the political officer to another place. The political officer is the CO's brother and bunkmate and confidant and basically co-parent to the unit. He knows the commander's intent as well as the commander does. And he's just as experienced and capable with combat operations as the commander. At least that's how it is in the Army. In the technical services, like the PLARF, the Rocket Force, and the Air Force and Navy, that's more of an aspirational ideal, but I digress. So on operations, on a march, a common division of labor is for the CO to be near the front of the column and the political officer to be near the back, where he babysits the rear guard and the baggage column and watches over interactions with the civilian populace. Now, notice this is a further reason why we've been getting so many stories lately from the Sino-Vietnamese War of attacks on PLA supply lines when out of nowhere, the political officer pops up, sometimes a surprisingly senior political officer. Recently, we mentioned the militia porters who served 41 Corps, whose highs and lows we've talked a lot about, and we've only begun with the adventures and misadventures of 41 Corps. Well, you might remember that those porters were crossing a river, and right about the time that some experienced old boot was probably saying, things are quiet, too quiet, something's wrong. Right about that time, a company of Vietnamese commandos opened up and started sawing them in half. And that jam-packed river became this drunken orgy of panicked porters and screaming mules who were running in every direction and knocking each other over. And then mixed in among all of them were the few militiamen who actually had rifles, and they were shooting in every direction, failing to suppress the VPA, but they were gunning down a lot of friendlies. And right when hope seemed to be lost, who came along and saved the day but the commissar of the whole division among this mob of muleteers and panic-firing militiamen, which seems below his pay grade. It would be like if your house caught on fire, but a fire truck just happened to be driving by, and then it turned out to be driven by the Archangel Michael. That was this. That was like having the divisional political officer just stand up in the middle of your ambush and go, "Follow me." Well, this must have seemed equally unlikely, but there was a reason for it. Probably, even though the regiment's combat troops had left these poor baggage porters behind, the political officer was probably still lurking around there with a few guys keeping an eye on them. Now, speaking of Vietnam, the political officer's other huge boon to the CO was that he was someone that the CO could talk to and bitch to and complain to and confide in a way that would have been inappropriate with a subordinate. And here's the real biggie. He could also help the CO decide when to say fuck it and break the rules. Because the political officer was just as qualified and as experienced as the CO, and he was equal in rank and authority, the CO was never alone. He never bore the burden of command by himself. He always had a peer and a confidant in the political officer. And the political officer could listen to him, give him feedback, just let him bitch and complain when he needed to, and help the CO game things out. Here is a great example of that. During the 1980s, the border war with Vietnam kept simmering, and there would be hot, cold, sometimes very hot warfare between the two. Well, there was one period when Beijing decided to try to lower the temperature, and it ended up severely constricting the rules of engagement for one of its divisions. Down in the 32nd Division, the CO, Liu Yuzun, was essentially forbidden to fire his heavy guns at the Vietnamese. However, his divisions were getting shelled, and yet he had to forbid his troops from answering the Vietnamese with anything bigger than a recoilless rifle. And also, he was not allowed to tell his troops why. So basically, Beijing thought it was making peace overtures to the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese were telling Beijing to sod off 155 millimeters at a time. And those shells were hurting Colonel Liu's troops. So he had to carry the can for Beijing's stupid policy. Me, friends, that is the kind of leadership job that I hate the most. I can't stand being the face for a stupid policy when professionalism forbids me to just like roll my eyes in front of my subordinates and say, well, don't blame me, blame my stupid bosses. It had to have been extremely torturous for Liu to just watch his subordinates get their arms blown off and still not be able to give any explanation. That had to have been awful. Well, this is exactly something that political officers were invented for, namely, ministering to the hearts and minds of the command staff itself. Because Colonel Liu, the CO, did have a confidant, his divisional commissar, Liu Xiancheng, and this was a paradigm case of why the party and the PLA went to all the trouble and expense of providing him with a political officer. Here we have a perfect example of the CCP's integrating military and political affairs. They were trying to get their behavior on the battlefield to send a diplomatic signal to Hanoi. And of course, that was maddening for the commanders of those units and searing for the men in the trenches. It was suckage all the way down. I don't need to explain this because it's been a principal theme of American war movies ever since the Vietnam era. And maybe that's how the American people deals with these problems, namely cinematically and artistically. But China does these things differently. That's what political officers are for. They are in charge of being the listening ear for all of this stuff at every level, even for the divisional commander, especially for the divisional commander. That commander, Colonel Liu's political commissar, was there to talk him off the ledge when that's what he needed. And the commissar would have been the main guy in charge of figuring out how the hell do we explain to our subordinate commanders why we're not letting them shoot back at the Vietnamese without spilling any of the politically forbidden beans to them. And remember, all those subordinate commanders also had their own political officers who were doing the same thing for them too, all the way down to the company political officers who were living in the trenches with the men, serving as their den mother and as the helpmeet of the company commander. And all of that help could go a long way toward letting the unit commanders focus on winning the war, since the political officer could do the bulk of the housekeeping and the emotional labor. In the 32nd Division and 11 Corps, those commissars really earned their pay during that war. Colonel Leo finally got a meeting with his chain of command to discuss their insane orders to not fire at the VPA and to try to tactfully reflect the conditions at the grassroots level to them. He kind of freaked out during that meeting. He was starting to cry as he explained his men's suffering. And then, because he was losing emotional control, he just stopped talking and he went awkwardly silent for a long time. Probably, I think, so that he wouldn't just open his mouth and say something really insubordinate to the general officer. And this is when the commissar gently stepped in and helped Leo compose himself and said, okay, we'll have a word with your Corps HQ and we'll see what we can do about this. Now, after that, they did untie the division's hands, but by that point, Leo's officers had all kind of been trained out of much of their independence. And so one day, Leo actually got an urgent call. One of his companies had repelled an attack by some Vietnamese infiltrators, and they had the remaining enemy cornered. And they were calling division to find out what they should do. That question came from a regimental commander, a full colonel equivalent. And the incredulous Leo answered, in effect, what should you do? How about fighting the fucking enemy? Better yet, go get me a prisoner. Why do I have to tell you this? Well, his political officer could have told him it's because the troops in the trenches weren't just machines that could change their program at the touch of a button. They were humans and they had been given mixed signals and trained into hesitation and passivity. Then came what I think is the most fascinating PLA order I've ever heard of. When their division finally came off the line after about 4 months, they got some time to rest and refit in the rear area of the combat zone. And after that, they would be rotated back into combat after Spring Festival, which we can think of as Chinese Christmas and Thanksgiving all rolled into one. It's a huge deal. People travel for days under appalling conditions so that they can spend Spring Festival with their families. And it would suck, of course, to spend the holiday season in a war zone. But it would suck especially if you had just taken 400 casualties and then right after that you were getting sent back into the war zone for more hot trench warfare. So Leo and his commissar took some initiative of their own. They decided to break some rules. Leo went to his deputy ops commander and told him, I want you to coordinate with motor transport and start trucking in soldiers' families if they want to come. What he didn't need to explain was the division really needed the morale boost after the shellacking that they had been through. Now, were they supposed to truck civilians into a war zone where God knows what could happen to them? Absolutely not. Not according to the rule book. But because Leo had buy-in from his commissar, in fact, I'll bet that this was the commissar's own idea, the two of them together could say, fuck the rule book. The commissar was there precisely to look out for the men's welfare and to help decide what rules were worth flouting. So he and the commander decided, we're doing this. And if higher headquarters has a problem with it and wants to throw the rule book at the two of us, fine, we'll take the hit. I'm sure it's easier to do that, defy higher headquarters and declare an exception on your own authority when there are two of you to make the decision and you can diffuse the responsibility. And I would guess that the PLA built this feature in intentionally, that the commissar isn't just meant to throw cold water on the CO if he starts to do something impolitic, but also in cases where it would be good for the man on the ground to declare an exception and throw the rules out the window, then the military commander has somebody who's right at his elbow who can say, I agree, and I will throw my weight as the ranking party representative behind you. Let's go. So the commissar can be the enabler here, even the catalyst, if that's what the situation calls for. He doesn't just have to be Mr. No, who puts the brakes on initiative. He's the party's man on the spot who can bolster that initiative and ratify a judgment call. Friends, my political officer, Mrs. 56, is my enabler to do this channel, largely because of the largesse of our Patreon PLA trends, who make it worth her while to give up her husband from childcare and home repair duties. If you would like to help that as a vanguard of the revolution, you may go over to Patreon and help us out. And no matter what, if you like this sort of content, please like and subscribe because this course remains free to all the world's workers, soldiers, and peasants, both the command track and the political work track. I am Jason Clower. I cannot wait to talk to you next time.